professional that I am, I guess, but let's try. Okay, so hello and welcome back, and a very warm welcome to this episode today, where I'm joined by Lou. Lou, great to have you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Johannes. Really excited, actually.
Yeah, me too. But because what are we talking about today?
So I think we're going to be talking about cloud development environments or developing in the cloud. So I think we're going to have a bit of a dive into CodeCatalyst, right? Have a look at CodeCatalyst dev environments and how that works and why. I think for a lot of people watching, maybe there's sort of a question about why would you do this? So certainly let's get into that. And then I think we're also going to have a look at Gitpod, which is kind of similar. And then, talk about the pros, cons, differences, and have a look at the experience.
Yeah, and see how it actually works, right? So really touch it. So let's try with baselining a little bit. What is a cloud development environment from your perspective?
Yeah, so it's kind of the combination of a few things. At its core, fundamentally, what you're doing is you're not developing on your local machine, but you're developing in the cloud. And the question is, why would you want to do that? Well, there's quite a few sort of advantage from doing so. One of the big ones is automation. So on your machine, when you kind of swap between projects, or let's say you go to an open source project or a project in your company and you open a pull request, then you have to then go and install everything on your machine, configure everything, and that every time that you move between a project, start a new company, etc., like you have this this onboard time. It's sort of like a commute that you have to do where you're installing all of these things on your machine. And as a developer, the more that you do that, the more that becomes quite a pain. So that's one certain aspect, is you can codify all of those steps. So you're getting started in your README file rather than having that as literal steps in your README. You can then put that into a script, automate that, and then run that. And it goes a little bit further because then you can start to get a little bit more technical with this. You can start to automate sort of things like port configurations and what ports you need to expose and how you expose them, installing extensions and personalizing the workspace. And what you're getting to there is, you get an environment that's already set up with all of the different stuff that you need to do your job and all of your different preferences all kind of bundled together.
Yeah, and I think that is a great thing to try out. We actually rushed a little bit directly into very details of the topic.
Yes.
I'll try to baseline it a little bit more even down, right, than
Yes,
that.
absolutely.
So in one of my personal projects that I've been running, I think let's spend a second on where did you and I meet before we talk about that project. Maybe you want to share with the audience a little bit how we met.
Yeah, of course. So we met through the Community Builders program with AWS. I've been part of Community Builders for about 3 years now. I've been working on AWS for about 10 years. When I first sort of touched AWS, I didn't realize what it was going to become. So, and then, in terms of myself, so there's kind of two sides to me. There's the Community Builder side, which is me personally, and I run a YouTube channel and a blog called Open Up the Cloud, where I talk about the cloud industry, and it's mostly about sort of careers and research and data and stuff. And I try to just really open up the industry so people that are new to it or changing careers or kind of looking for promotions, that they get sort of access to data and interviews from people in the industry. And that's been super fun. I love doing that. Occasionally it means diving into tech topics as well and stuff like that. And then there's the other side of me, which is the Gitpod side. So I'm a product manager at Gitpod, and I've been a developer for a long time. I started working in sort of platform teams, developer experience teams, and had the opportunity a couple of years back to go and work with Gitpod. I saw the product and I was like completely sort of obsessed with this new technology and where it was going. And I just wanted to kind of work on cloud development environments, and I really believed in them as being the future. And ever since then, the market has kind of gone a little bit crazy, like lots of sort of products coming out and people trying the technology. And it's been really great because that's now really fueling the sort of the tech ecosystem around the cloud development environments as well.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty cool, really, really cool. And you're the perfect person to talk to me about the CodeCatalyst dev environments, which are a little bit comparable to Gitpod, I would say. And with the session today, we aim to kind of put them aside, right, and then see, well, what's the feeling like? Knowing, of course, that Gitpod is like 5 years old, CodeCatalyst is like 1 year old. I believe that there is some things we can expect from Gitpod we cannot from the dev environments today, right? But let's try to dive in and let's try to have a look on how that actually looks like, right? And how that works. So why am I interested personally as in a cloud development environment, right? Well, I switch devices. I do some stuff on my local PC. I do some stuff on my work PC. I do some stuff on my laptop. I may even sometimes want to do a code change on an iPad or on an iPhone or something like that if really, really required, right? So that's where I think that cloud development environments will also really play a role if you get to be quick and have a feature parity to the local IDEs that you usually use as a developer. While we're talking about that, from a dev environment's perspective in CodeCatalyst, I know that there is an option to run a dev environment in a browser, and then there is an option to run a dev environment remotely and connect your local IDE
yes.
to that backend, right? Is that something that Gitpod also offers?
Yes, absolutely. So Gitpod started off actually with the browser integration. So back in the day, Gitpod actually used to use an IDE called Thea, which is a browser IDE. It's now living under the Eclipse Foundation. And a couple of years back, basically we switched to VS Code. So Gitpod itself actually does run VS Code in the browser, and that's been what Gitpod originally kind of got known for quite a lot. But the desktop integrations, I think, are lesser known still to this day. But it's a huge part of the product actually. So you can create a dev environment and then connect that up to VS Code on your machine, or vice versa. You can actually open VS Code and then connect that way. But it's not just VS Code. There's also JetBrains. They released a product called JetBrains Gateway, which allows JetBrains IDEs basically to connect up to a remote server as well. So you can use the full suite of JetBrains IDEs, and and then also finally, there's a new IDE that JetBrains created called Fleet, which I think also will come into this space as well, because I think they're building that very much with remote development in mind as well. So that's one to watch. And especially if you're sort of into the JetBrains ecosystem and you're kind of interested in remote development, for sure, watch that one, because I think that one will soon be integrated in some of these tools as well.
Yeah. On the browser version, I think Google just announced something last week around
Yes.
IDX, which seems to be going into the similar direction, I would say, right? I think that's also something that we should watch from that perspective. But I would suggest let's start diving into comparison, and I will take the lead in sharing some CodeCatalyst content here and setting some stuff prepared, so we can then log into Gitpod as well. So let me share my screen. We're using this kind of new tool for me, but I believe that I should be fairly good in using it. Let's see. Okay, cool. Here we are. So what are we going to look at? Well, Gitpod operates on GitHub only projects, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can hook up to different source control providers, basically. But GitHub is. Let's go with GitHub for today.
Okay, cool. So then we're gonna use a project that I've been opening a few weeks, month ago. Not really worked on recently, but that's CI/CD on LMS, which is a project in my GitHub repository. I also have a connection in CodeCatalyst. So now we're back in CodeCatalyst here, where I have a project which is called CI/CD on AWS, and I've connected this GitHub repository through the source repositories here as well. In the CodeCatalyst interface, you can now see at the moment that I do not have any dev environment set up. So my proposal would be I'll just get it created. It will take a few seconds, maybe minutes to start. And then while we wait for the environment to come up, we can look at the same kind of flow in Gitpod, sorry for that. What you see over here is that I could be creating a Visual Studio Code backend or a backend for one of the JetBrains IDEs as well in the dev environments. To make it easy today, we're going to use the browser version and compare those. So I'm just going to click on this button. I can now define on what the connection will be for this dev environment. I could be creating a new branch. This does not work if I talk to GitHub project at the moment from a dev environment's perspective, right? So CodeCatalyst does not yet allow to create branches out of this dialog. I hope that this is something that is going to come soon as well. And then I can just click create, and I can also, of course, name my dev environment. And now it's going to take a few minutes to actually bring up this Cloud9 instance, which is the browser IDE that I think AWS announced in 2018, if I remember correctly, after an acquisition. So that's going to take a few minutes. While we wait for that, let's look at the same experience in Gitpod. So I will stop sharing, and now let's see.
You want to share on my screen? I can do. Let me just bring up a browser.
Let's try to do it side by side, and then we'll see where we get.
That's fine. Just give you 1 second just to open up that repository. And let me share my screen.
Funny enough, the dev environment is already set up in the background. That was way faster than the last time I tried.
You landed lucky on a node or something like this.
Most probably, yeah.
Yeah, so just before this call, I quickly just raised the pull request actually into the repository, so I can actually start a workspace from that. So you can start workspaces in Gitpod a few different ways, but I'm going to use a browser extension at the moment. So I have the browser extension installed, and that adds me a little Gitpod button up here. And what that does is it takes the context of what you're looking at. So pull request, issues, you mentioned about the branch. So what if I go ahead and hit that? It actually passes through the context URL here, which tells it which piece of code to pull. And that will link also to the configuration as well. So I've got my options very similar for the different IDEs. I actually have access for a terminal in the browser that's in private beta at the moment, but it's very, same thing as VS Code, but you just get a regular terminal, which is actually very, very handy. But let's go ahead with VS Code. You can choose preferences for workspace class.
Is that something that you notice? So is the environment really faster if you go bigger?
Yeah, certainly, okay. Yes. Depends on what you need. Let's go ahead. I think that's everything that we need for that. And whilst that just loads VS Code for me, I will just mention that within this PR, I just added a very minimal Gitpod YAML config, which basically is just going to run a few steps. It inferred this configuration from your repository, so I don't know if that's exactly what we need to run there, but let's see.
Cool. So a very similar experience here from that perspective. Let's go back to while Gitpod starts up, and let's have a look once again on how the dev environment now looks like that we just brought up. So as you can see, when I press the right buttons, we in the browser that we just saw a few seconds ago, we come up with a short notification. Well, yeah, there is an AWS toolkit by default installed. We can now go ahead and configure that if required. In simple, this is Cloud9 IDE. You can love it, you can hate it, right? I think it has good and bad parts, but here you see all of the settings for this actual dev environment. On the left-hand side, you see the code also checked out of the repository, right? You can then see source control changes. You can explore here the AWS toolkit. Down here, you can see, well, you get Code Whisperer out of the box. You get some things that you can kind of touch on, configure, right? We're going to talk about that in a second as well. And if you use CDK, you also see the deployments at the end, right? As you can see, I didn't run CDK synth yet. I can do that, and then it will actually show me also the structure of that. When CodeCatalyst announced dev environments, it did not have that automated integration with the builder ID. So I think this is going to be pretty cool, right? So at the moment, it really connects directly with the builder ID, and this then gives you the power of using Code Whisperer directly out of the box, which is kind of the tooling, the coding companion. Other than that, it's an IDE, right? So it has built-in, I think, Markdown support. I'm not sure about preview, but it has at least built-in support for highlighting and stuff like that. It comes with TypeScript support directly as well. Of course, that's what you would be expecting as well, right? And my connection down here, right, is directly set up to actually being able to pull or to push, right, into that repository, right, out of the box, which is pretty cool. Let's leave it there first, and let's look at Gitpod next, right? So how does a high-level overview look like of the IDE? Let me see. Okay, there we are.
Cool. Let me open this up on my machine as well. One sec. So I think maybe some of you that are used to VS Code will be very familiar with this interface. It's very much exactly VS Code. It literally runs on. We run a project called Open VS Code Server, and VS Code has actually released now the sort of server implementation
Mhm.
for VS Code. So you can host this on your own machine if you want. If you don't want to use CodeCatalyst or Gitpod, and you want to just run a EC2 image or something like this, and you want to install VS Code and connect up, you can do that as well. So yeah, it's very much VS Code, exactly like you're used to. There's very little difference. The only sort of slight quirks of running in the browser is, for instance, your keyboard shortcuts like Command W is just overridden by the browser, so you
Mhm.
might need to set up some different key bindings for that. But that's kind of the trade-off that you make in terms of running in the browser. But it can be very handy. Certainly we find a lot of people really like it for reviewing pull requests and that kind of thing. And especially once you've also got your environment running in the browser, what's very cool is that's now running on the internet, right? So it's very easy to also to share that as well. So you can share that workspace as well with others. I can go
Oh,
ahead and
that's cool.
make my workspace accessible. I can send you that link, and then we can kind of code together on the same
And
workspace,
that
which is
means that I will then also see what you are typing at the same time.
yeah, exactly. So you've got access to the same machine. And then yeah, you can go further because you can even plug in sort of third-party collaboration plugins and things like that if you want to as well. And really depends on your use case, but yeah.
So in my Visual Studio Code, usually the Explorer is on the left-hand side. Is this something that is a
This
setting in
is
Gitpod, or is this your personal preference?
no, this is personal preference. I'm a hipster. It's because someone told me at some point that if you have it on the right and your code is in the left, it doesn't shift your code.
But
So it's a personal preference.
that makes sense. I think the more interesting piece is that this is a user ID preference that has been
Yeah.
set up, or is this a preference for the machine?
No, that's actually a user preference. So you have a blend, really. It's an interesting point. So what we mentioned before with like the Gitpod YAML and the dev environments, CodeCatalyst uses the dev file specification, but this is kind of like your shared configuration across your team, like tied to the repository. Sorry, yeah, to the repository. And you could put flags in there. You could use environment variables for conditions if you wanted for different situations.
Okay,
But
just pause.
oh, okay,
This is the magic at the end of the cloud dev environment, I would say,
yes,
right? Let's spend another second on that.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
what does this allow you as a user to do? So baselining in Gitpod, the configuration file is called gitpod.yaml. In the CodeCatalyst dev environments, we have the same, which is called dev environments, devfile.yaml at the end.
Yes,
Configuration flow is kind of the same or kind of similar. What do we
yes.
use that for?
Sure. So this is your sort of README as code, basically. So you're putting in the commands and things like that you need to run the repository. But as I mentioned before, there's other things you can add in there as well. So you can, for instance, put in information about your ports. So if I was running, let's say, a web server in port 3000, I could define that here. And then when the workspace starts, I can say also, expose this port, public, private, etc., and this kind of thing. And then you can add some other things in there in terms of VS Code. You can add extensions, and those are shared extensions. So anyone who opens this repo will get that sort of shared configuration.
Okay, so cool. This means that now, once we merge the pull request for the Gitpod YAML into that repository, the moment that I start a Gitpod based on that repository, it will actually automatically configure my dev environment, my cloud IDE,
Yep,
my cloud development environment. I'm sorry for that. Automatically
yep,
after opening up Gitpod. Is that that's
exactly.
what I understand? Okay, cool. Do I have the possibility to also define kind of the base images being used for
Mhm.
that and stuff like that?
Yeah, completely.
Okay, so it would be
You don't
cool
have
if
to don't have to define that at the top, but you can
okay.
basically just define that. Um,
And this would then also allow me to, as you mentioned, install extension like I don't know, superlinter or linter
mhm.
or security extensions or stuff like that. It would be mandatory for this cloud development environment, right?
Yep. Yes,
Okay,
exactly. And that's
that's yeah.
either in the image or in the tasks. You get a little bit of benefits around caching and portability with the image, but for simplicity, you can also just put them directly in the YAML or put it into a shell script and just invoke that as well. So
Okay, and that's exactly what I did not yet configure for CodeCatalyst dev environments either here for this repository, right? Because then we would not have seen the error message that we just saw, which said like you didn't run CDK synth, right? Which could be part
yes,
of this startup procedure, right?
absolutely.
Okay, cool. So let's just have a very brief look on CodeCatalyst. CodeCatalyst has the same functionality over here. So you can have something like a dev file. I think I already mentioned that. We mentioned that already. The dev file then has some specific structure, which is similar to the Gitpod structure. You can still define a lot of stuff here, right? You can pull up an image, right? Something that stands out here, and I'm not sure how that is today in Gitpod, is this image, I think right now needs to be public available, or at least my credentials need to somehow give me access to that instance, right? If I look at this from an enterprise perspective and adapting cloud development environments from enterprise perspective, I would love to have maybe a private image, right? That I can just, as you mentioned, in a platform engineering or developer experience engineering team or whatever, right? I could provision that instance so every developer in the company, regardless of which project he's part of, starts with the same kind of dev environment, right? Um, I need to read the documentation closer if this is already possible. I know that a few months ago it was not in CodeCatalyst. How do you do that in Gitpod? So am I allowed to or able to provide my own image, which is in a private repository?
Yeah, certainly. So it gets a little bit slightly more interesting in Gitpod because we have two offerings.
Mhm.
So there's the Gitpod Cloud, which is sort of the multi-tenant Gitpod IO instance, but then we also have another product offering, which is Gitpod Dedicated, which we install in the customer's cloud account. So it's slightly different in terms of private registry setup. There is support for private registry in Gitpod Dedicated, and we're sort of iterating and evolving on that. And we were literally discussing this very recently as well, just to add even more sort of configurations there, so you can connect up that basically your Gitpod installation and point that to certain registries. And there's obviously certain things you can start to do there about locking that down. So if you're running your dev environments on a specific domain, you're linking that to the registry and making
Mhm.
sure that only that installation can access that registry, and the other sort of fine grained sort of access permissions that you might want as well under that as well.
Yeah,
But
okay,
yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah, so kind of an enterprise offering, right?
yes,
Okay, yeah, and that's I think what CodeCatalyst also kind of misses today, right? A little bit more enterprise ready stuff, things like single sign-on, which would then allow me to use user credentials of my own um, current how to say IDP or something like that, right? I think that's something that hopefully we're going to see soon. The configuration documentation for CodeCatalyst is in the classic AWS way, but I believe pretty good to understand. You can define all kind of stuff, and I need to admit I did not personally play around with it a lot, right? But this seems like something that you would potentially then going forward be including in all of your projects, right? So I can imagine the same Gitpod YAML or dev file YAML being used across like 500 projects, which then really gives you that seamlessly experience that we talked about at the beginning, right? Um, Anything else for dev file that we wanted to talk about or that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I feel like we've covered the majority of it there. I think that it's just but for both files, I think what you're trying to do there is trying to configure as much as possible in your sort of declarative file. It's infrastructure as code for your development environment. That is really what it is, and I think I don't think there's necessarily too much more to dig into that on that side.
Cool. Then let's have a short look on as Gitpod seems, let's say, a little bit more powerful right now than Cloud IDE or Cloud 9, because you have the possibility to integrate your own extensions here as well, right? So how would that now look in Gitpod? So we saw I can do that by adopting the Gitpod YAML, but can I
Yep.
also do that on the fly?
Yeah, completely. I can share my screen to show you some of this if you want as well. Let me go back to my previous one. So Yeah, so what you can do is, so VS Code actually comes out of the box with something called settings sync.
Hmm.
And what that does is it will sync your settings across different versions of VS Code, wherever that's running and you're logged into your Microsoft account. We
Hmm.
also have a slight different flavor as well. So basically, we have our own configuration for settings sync also with Gitpod, which I'm not necessarily, I don't know if I'm going to go through here. Let's have a look at settings sync. I think if you just go through the regular configuration flow, I'd have to pull up the docs for that. But that basically then, when you're in Git, whether you're in Gitpod or even actually if you're in VS Code generally or with any other tool, that's just going to sync up your settings, plugins, your themes, colors, and that kind of thing. And this actually is a different instance that's not actually configured with my settings. Sorry, this is the
other
one
one
we were
that we
looking at.
looked at. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And now you can directly on the fly add new extensions. Now, what happens if you stop this machine? Are they gone again?
No. It persists that state because it uses the same sort of setting sync state as well. So it brings all that back for you as well.
Okay, well, that's cool. Yeah, then how is the integration kind of looking from an autocomplete perspective that all works out of the box in Gitpod?
Yes, in terms of sort of the IntelliSense and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah, it all kind of works out of the box. Like most of that runs on the server, and then the client itself is then just a thin interface into that. So I don't know if we've in this project, what have we got? We got some TypeScript stuff in here.
Yeah, it's a super big project to be honest, and it's really perfect for using as demonstration purposes. Maybe we should have chosen something better, but that's not
Yeah,
the
but
point, right? The idea was really to compare those two cloud development environments.
yeah, absolutely. Cool.
Yeah, so those settings sharing and saving the settings, this is something that I think the dev environments do not have today, right? I believe that that's something that hopefully will come as well in one of the next iterations of the dev environments over here, right?
I think
Now, just
if
one last thing on Gitpod. It comes directly with possibility to commit and push to the repository as well because it uses your OAuth credentials. So how is this connected to GitHub?
yes, and so it will all set that up for you at the moment. So if I'm pretty sure I'm on the branch that I just pulled, but this should be my fork. So we actually made some changes to that Gitpod YAML. So I'm going to commit them to that branch.
Yay!
Maybe I'll revert them after. Let's say changes to Gitpod YAML, and let's go ahead and push those. Oh, sorry, just need to add that file. And let's go ahead and push. I can just briefly show you just two other things if you want, actually, kind of related to the idea of portability of settings.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is dot files. So we basically have a feature called dot files, which acts as a repository, and when you start the workspace, it actually clones that and runs that in your workspace, and that's a way that you can actually also have additional settings. So if you want to install extra packages or bring bash aliases and things like that into your workspace, you can do that essentially via dot files, which is a really nice way of adding additional personalization that's on top of, let's say the things that are IDE specific, like the VS Code settings sync. And within my personal dot files, I have a tool called Atwin, which is a bash history tool, which I'm a little bit worried to open now because I don't know what's in my own bash history. But if I press my up arrow key here, I get basically the history from all of my different instances across Gitpod and my local machine and things like that, because it persists to a central server, my terminal history, which is also really nice when you're using cloud development environments, because you're then carrying that history as well with you, which is quite cool. Certainly, if you're a heavy sort of terminal user, that's something that's can be quite handy.
Mm-hmm.
You can feel quite naked without your terminal history.
Okay, makes sense. I would need to connect the AWS credentials if I want to access AWS resources here, right?
Yeah. So one of the ways that the way that Gitpod does that is we have there's a CLI tool.
Okay.
I'll just show you that for Amazon. So this actually uses OpenID Connect. So if you create an identity provider on the AWS side, you can exchange this token with AWS to get access credentials like your key or your secret, and essentially that's an STS token. And then you can take that command, script that, put it into your Gitpod YAML, and then when your workspace starts, it's going to do the sort of token exchange, pull your access keys, and then your environment set up, and then you also have access, which is very cool as well.
But this would then be an account that is tied to this instance. So if I share it with you, you would be using the same AWS credentials at the end, obviously.
It depends on how you configure it, really.
Okay.
Gitpod is typically used in like a company setting, so like you
Okay.
might have your AWS account set up, and then you'll add some sort of conditions in there, maybe for individual users. You could use environment variables, like you can set environment variables per repository and globally here. So when you open your workspace, like as Johannes, you could have, this is Johannes and this is the AWS account ID I want to connect to, and then you'd just interpolate that into a shell script and then connect to the AWS account that you maybe define. So yeah, it really depends how you set that up. But
cool. Yeah, it makes sense. So then let's look back now at getting out of the IDE again, of the cloud
absolutely.
development environment. How's that flow? All right. So now you kind of just close the browser and you're done.
Yes. So in terms of that, that kind of comes into the sort of the timeout. So within the browser, we actually have an additional setting. If you don't update your customized timeout, we actually use we basically will time out the workspace after 5 minutes.
Mhm.
We're looking at adding additional controls to that as well. But if you extend the timeout, then it'll actually just sit there, and you can extend that up to I think it's 24 hours. So if you wanted the workspace to just sit there and never time out, you can also do that as well. And it depends really on your preference and the project that you're working on, how quick you might want the project itself to time out. And obviously there's a bit of a balance there between sort of the cost you're paying for the running workspace versus the sort of the developer experience that you're trying to achieve.
Yes, I understood that. So, but still, you would be closing it, or is there a shutdown button? So, what I'm kind of interested in is exactly that developer experience piece. Like, well, now we went from GitHub, we went into Gitpod. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I'm done with my code changes, ideally, right?
Yep.
Now I need to go back into GitHub to
Mm-hmm.
actually see my PR, right? That
Mm-hmm.
would be just a different browser tab, I would assume, right?
Yeah, and we really encourage users to script everything in that Gitpod YAML, because then what they can do is they can really just start to throw these away. Open that PR, check out the code, do your work, commit, and then just stop the workspace, and then just leave it. And then eventually we do a cleanup process. You can pin the workspace to keep it around, but otherwise we just eventually then just recycle the workspace.
Okay. Is there a possibility right now to kind of perform actions on stopping the environment? So think like um, if I stop my environment, I want to ensure that the stuff that I was just working
Mm-hmm.
on that might not have been committed, that it gets
Mm-hmm.
committed automatically.
Kind of like a stop hook.
Yes.
So we don't have that out of the box. You can hook into like the operating system like signal commands for that. It's not super user friendly, but the lifecycle hooks is certainly something that we want to add, because it's or make that easier. Because for instance, if you want to couple your dev environment, like this dev environment, with some infrastructure, let's say like an ephemeral stack, and you want to run CloudFormation, and you want that to go up and down at the same time, then you could do that. But we don't have there's not native support for that just yet, but you can. There are ways of doing it by hooking into like sort of signal terminals.
Okay. That sounds like something I would want to have, right? Especially if you do serverless development or CDK watch like type development through that, right? If you
Exactly.
have that idea of I start my dev environment, I get that ephemeral environment of the cloud infrastructure set up, then I shut down the dev environment again or the Gitpod again,
Yes.
and it would then automatically go away again, right? I think that sounds pretty powerful. So why did I ask that question? I was just going through the documentation of CodeCatalyst. I'm sharing my screen, but I'm not. Which at the end says dev file feature supported, right? And it says post start, right? Now I want to have a post stop. That would be my first
Yes.
request to the CodeCatalyst team as well to actually support that. How does
Yeah.
the stop work from a CodeCatalyst perspective? Once again, we are here in Cloud 9. We have the AWS toolkit over here. I can do the stop dev environment over here. Which is what I'm going to do in a second. But before I go there, I wanted to show like there are some kind of handy links, right? That CodeCatalyst or the Cloud IDE is built by building in out of the box or automatically, right? So I don't know if Gitpod has that functionality as well, right? So kind of add some custom links or custom stuff, because this is something where I believe that CodeCatalyst going forward could be playing out a true kind of unique user experience, where Gitpod might have it a little bit more difficult because you I think you don't control GitHub, so you cannot link in GitHub. You need that browser extension or other stuff, right? And that seamless experience is something that I'm hoping to make better for developers. So let's stop this one. The timeout for dev environments, by the way, is 15 minutes usually in CodeCatalyst. So what you see over here is timeout 50 minutes. I can configure that. As you saw initially, and now let's see, your dev environment had stopped. I can resume it. I can just safely close this browser now. What we saw at the beginning, I was able to create a dev environment only with 2 vCPUs and 4 GB RAM. Reason for that, I'm on the free tier on CodeCatalyst. I'm not paying for the service right now, right? If you pay for the service, you can define your own compute instances and sizes as well, and then ensure that you kind of get faster here. Yeah, that's, as you can see, this is still stopping. There is also no stop hook that allows me to do certain stuff, right? But I think this is really where it will then change the way that developers actually think about this, right? But this might only work if you're in a serverless world where deploying out stuff is pretty fast, right? Think of a project that has Kubernetes clusters on it. You don't want to wait 20 minutes until the infrastructure has been deployed, right? I think that's where maybe we need to do some more preferences around that. Cool. Anything else from a Gitpod perspective that you wanted to share? Or should we move over to a little bit of wrap up of what we looked at and what we learned today, Lou?
Yeah, well, let me just briefly show you one other thing, because I was just thinking in relation to the commands you mentioned and the customization. I'll just show you one final thing. So this is I basically just started the workspace actually using the terminal, and like I say, this is in private beta, but will be available soon. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is also because, just to show you as well, like, because we have many different IDEs, JetBrains, VS Code, one of the sort of primary interfaces that's shared across those is this GP CLI, and that's something that we load into every workspace, and that gives you sort of this unified experience where you can run commands, to sort of stop the workspace, etc., and change the timeout configurations as well. So just briefly wanted to mention that, because that's something that you kind of get parity across all of the different IDs as well. And yeah, if you're a terminal kind of person, then you've got all access to the sort of showed the tasks and the terminals and stuff. You've got access to all of those as well from the command line, which is quite neat and quite powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's something I didn't know. So thanks for sharing. Now, kind of wrap up, but let's start with a challenging question. Did you ever write code in Gitpod on an iPad?
You definitely can. I don't personally, but I know many people who do. One of there was another guy who used to work for Gitpod. He used to work entirely on his iPad. Actually, he was very fanatical about it. But yeah, works totally fine. VS Code works, like the terminal interface works. And you can get quite elaborate with it. People in our community use sort of like the Mosh terminal apps and stuff like this to, it's becoming a bit of a trend amongst sort of part of the dev community to kind of, run these dev environments on your iPad or your phone or this kind of thing. There's actually a really great story from one of our employees as well, how he found Gitpod running it on an Android device. And that's actually how he learned to code, is using Gitpod to run Rust on his Samsung phone.
Wow. That's pretty cool. So what, from a summary perspective, what did we learn today in this session?
Yeah, I think we sort of dipped our toes into cloud development environments. I mean, one thing I will say is we looked there probably very much at like the sort of user perspective of this, which obviously is the bit that comes to mind, I think. But there's a lot more that you dig into this, I think, also when you come from sort of a company perspective and the benefits to an organization in terms of what you mentioned before with the images and the automation and the images and the standardization and security and things that comes with that as well. But yeah, I think what we're seeing is we're at the start of a bit of a trend in this technology, and we're seeing now an advance in the tooling, the integrations, the different products that are available. I think it's really going to really sort of escalate in terms of the the ecosystem around cloud development environments. And yeah, I'd really encourage people to go and have a play and explore it for yourself, because I think only till you start playing with it can you start to understand the power and the potential with this type of technology. And certainly if someone's, you know, a little bit skeptical, maybe, is go and have a look, because I think a lot of the things that you think might be friction points are actually kind of starting to become almost all solved now. We mentioned all about the personalization and you know, syncing of terminal history and stuff like that. Like, so yeah.
Yep. And I personally think that we saw that both products are kind of working from an easy kind of standpoint. We did not look into details and how that actually works from a seamlessly perspective, how the
Yes.
flow is, and these kind of stuff. I think that's also what developers need to find out. With a cloud ID, a cloud development environment, I think it's the same like with a normal IDE. Everyone will find his own preference, right? Something will work for
Absolutely.
him or will not work for her. And I think that's where also people need to just experience it and try out. I already mentioned that, but if I kind of look at it from a really end-to-end user's perspective, um, the dev environments being kind of integrated in the CodeCatalyst in the CodeCatalyst kind of space feels a little bit more native. Well, does it? Not yet, right? So at the moment, you still get that new browser window. You still have that thing like you go out of your current browser tab, which has the CodeCatalyst overview, and maybe that's something that we can do going forward, right? From a CodeCatalyst perspective, I can see if you really get that one user interface that is overarching, right? That it shouldn't matter for you if you click on I want to open a dev environment or if you just edit a file in your source code repository, right? And I think that's where I hope that there will be more seamless integrations also for Gitpod and other players in the market, right? So it really becomes this developer has one user interface. He doesn't need to think about where to switch and where to go, right? And this is then something that comes to be a true integrated development, let's say, platform, right? We don't have that anywhere as far as I know today, right? Um, and that's what I'm hoping for as an engineer. In your role as a Gitbug product manager, please take this as input, right? And then let's see how we can streamline that kind of experience as well going forward. Lou, can I also ask you to kind of give me two things that work good in Gitpod, two things that work good in CodeCatalyst from your perspective. Is that something that stands out that you believe that you can learn from the dev environments?
So philosophically, it seems that CodeCatalyst is going like a slightly different direction in terms of what you mentioned about like the seamless integration across the different areas. So it's kind of two different products. It depends on your needs. So CodeCatalyst, you know, the issue tracking in there and some of the CI/CD environments in there. So Gitpod philosophically is designed to sort of integrate into the other tools that you have, like into if you're using GitHub or Bitbucket or you know, this kind of thing. And there's certainly a big overlap, I think, between issue tracking and dev environments and source control for sure. So that's going to be philosophically different. So it depends really on as a user or a customer. If you're very much in the AWS ecosystem, maybe some of those sort of like deep native integrations inside of CodeCatalyst will make sense. But if you have quite a broad or a varied sort of tech stack and you want to integrate with different tools, then I think that's where maybe Gitpod also makes sense as well, because it's built slightly philosophically different. But yeah, I say that's the big thing that stands out in terms of the difference.
Will we see? I can create a dev environment right now in CodeCatalyst
Mm-hmm.
for Cloud9, IDE, IntelliJ, blah blah blah. Will I see Gitpod coming up there soon?
Not that I'm aware of. Theoretically, maybe. I mean, for instance, JetBrains are working on trying to unify their current gateway platform so that it works cross cloud development environments. So you can start a dev environment, let's say, in these different providers in Gitpod and theoretically in CodeCatalyst as well. So I don't know if AWS would be the kind of like the central platform for that like cross development environments, or whether it would be other tools like JetBrains or etc. So I'm not sure, but definitely people are thinking about it. JetBrains is definitely thinking about it. Who knows? Maybe VS Code will do something similar. It would be
Yeah,
interesting to
let's
see.
see. Let's see if we can use your community builders role to connect you to the corresponding product manager on the AWS side, right? And then see whether we can get a partnership up there, right? Because Gitpod itself is not competing with CodeCatalyst at all. It's not competing with AWS at all, right? It is really another
No.
different experience of giving developers the possibility to interact with cloud development environments and code in the cloud, right? And maybe just integrating that Visual Studio Code browser version into CodeCatalyst would be a big benefit for the product itself.
Yeah, I would draw a parallel to sort of like monitoring tools and things like that. Like obviously you've got CloudWatch and things like this out of the box within AWS, but that doesn't mean that, New Relic and Dynatrace and all these other APM providers don't have their use for customers. So yeah, there's an overlap with AWS, but it's certainly not directly competitive. It really depends on customer needs, I suppose, as well.
Cool. Thank you so much. This has been awesome. It took us way longer than we expected, at least from the topics that we had prepared. But it was a really fun session. And I hope that everyone watching learned a lot. If you did not, please let us know. So reach out to Lou or to me. Before we kind of hand off, I am going to add a lot of kind of links to the video as well. But where can people find you online, and what drives you right now from a personal development perspective?
Yeah, I mean, working at Gitpod, I get to touch all aspects of the development lifecycle. This is a bit of a blessing and a curse. So I have like interests across all over the place. I'm very interested in sort of security and platforms right now as well. But in terms of finding me, my handle is LouJB on all different platforms, which I'll share a link just so you've got that. But I'm primarily on Twitter, a little bit on LinkedIn as well.
What's Twitter? I don't know that
Uh,
platform.
X.com. I don't even know
Yeah,
anymore.
true. Okay,
Exactly.
cool. And then obviously the YouTube channel Open Up the Cloud, which makes fantastic work
Yes.
for especially also starters in the cloud industry. I'm going to link that one as well. So thank you so much for coming on the show. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, Lou.
Thanks, Johannes. Thank you very much.